All right, in this lesson, I'm going to focus on just the principles of natural selection, Darwin's theory. So now you know a little bit about the history of our understanding of evolution. Let's focus in a little bit on Darwin's theory. And he, remember, proposed a way that evolution could happen. So if we say evolution is change, how does that change come about? Darwin came up with sort of a brilliant idea about how it works. So Darwin's ideas came out of an understanding of how we manipulate organisms. You watched in the video in class about the Hakea crabs and how we kind of cause this change to happen. And he really understood that. So one example of that, of course, is domesticated dogs. Originally, there were wolves. Dogs are basically the same species. They're a subspecies of wolf. And so through breeding practices, and I think we've talked about this in class, through breeding practices, we've managed to create wolves, what were once wolves, that look all these different ways with all these different breeds of dog, and we specifically bred for certain traits and certain characteristics. And Darwin figured, well, maybe that's happening in nature. Maybe if people can do it, maybe nature itself can do that, can make changes in organisms like that. So we're going to talk about the 4 principles of Darwin's theory, and I want you to make sure you write down these 4 on page 15 in your notes. The first principle of his theory is that organisms have natural variation of traits. And we've already studied about DNA and genetics, and you understand where that natural variation comes from. But no matter what organism you're looking at, pretty much there's good variation in traits. You can look at human beings, you can look at birds, you can look at plants, any kind of flower. Here's an example. These are all the same species of shellfish, and notice that they are not at all the same color. So there's natural variation in the shells of these shellfish, and so you can understand that each one might have a different experience based on their coloration. But this happens naturally in all species, that there is just slight variation. It might be color, it might be size, it might be even something like food preference. And this comes about naturally through genetics and DNA. So we talked about that, what causes the natural variations, genetics and DNA. Also remember, through sexual reproduction, we get all new combinations of genes. So you're combining genes from 2 different organisms in sexual reproduction. So you get a whole new combination and you get new traits that way. Also, there are random mutations. There are random changes that happen in the DNA. Not all of those mutations are bad. Obviously, some of them are going to be bad. We talked about proteins getting changed and stuff. But some mutations might be beneficial. Some mutations might not be a benefit or a detriment, but some of them actually might be helpful mutations. All right, the second principle of Darwin's theory is that organisms have too many babies. We call this overreproduction. Many species show this. They have many more babies than will survive. There's a couple of examples here. We have a dandelion flower. I'm sure you're familiar with the dandelion, a little yellow flower. It's a weed. When it completes producing the seeds, the flowers die away. You can kind of see them under here. The little flower petals die away, and you're left with this whole thing of seeds. And when you're a child, of course, you like to blow the seeds away, but even if you didn't, the wind would blow them away. And so all these seeds go blowing away. Are all of those going to become a dandelion plant? No. A lot of them won't make it to a place that's where they can grow. The same with, here we have a clownfish, the Nemo fish, and all of these little orange specks down below are actually its eggs. A fish oftentimes will lay hundreds and hundreds of eggs. And so this is true of many organisms. Not all, but many organisms have more babies than are going to survive. They over-reproduce. The third principle of Darwin's theory is that there's competition in the environment. I probably don't have to explain this too much, but I have an image here of the watering hole in Africa, and of course there's competition for water there. There's limited water, and there's only one place, and all the animals have to go there. So there is a danger for some of these gazelles and zebras to come to the watering hole because the predators are there. And of course there's a benefit to the predators hanging around the water hole. But there's competition. There's competition for food. There's competition for shelter. There's competition for mates. Not all organisms have an opportunity to reproduce, okay? Because there's going to be competition for who gets to reproduce with who, honestly. So there's always going to be competition in the environment. And finally, here's the crux of Darwin's idea. Those with the best traits are going to survive. And not only do they survive, they're going to reproduce, and their offspring will have their same traits. They're good traits that are adaptive and work well in the environment. Okay, the rest of them are going to die, and that could even lead to extinction if those with bad traits for the environment don't survive. If all of them that way, potentially that could lead to extinction. So here's a couple of examples. Of course, we have the cheetah and the antelope. The antelope, if it has good traits, it'll be able to run fast or hide. The cheetah, if it has good traits, it'll be cunning and it'll be able to run fast. And those cheetahs that are not fast enough won't eat, and they'll die. Those antelopes that are not fast enough will be eaten and will die. Here's another example. These are some crabs that are found on Christmas Island. I think they're just called Christmas Island crabs, but this species of crab, at a particular time, they migrate. They migrate all the way across the island, and you'll see hundreds and thousands of them crossing. Of course, you see them here crossing a road. Obviously, not all of those crabs are going to make it. Those that make it are the ones that are going to be able to reproduce, and whatever trait that allowed them to make it across the island without dying, they're going to pass that on to their offspring. So that's the idea behind natural selection. Now, natural selection occurs very slowly, but in short periods of time, we can see versions of natural selection. So we think of natural selection and evolution as occurring over thousands and thousands of years, but in our lifetimes, we have seen changes that show us how that natural selection can occur. One example of this was in these moths that are called peppered moths, and this was actually a case study that was done around the beginning of the 20th century. And what it is these moths, this species of moth, there are a couple of different variations in their coloration. Some of them have this peppered appearance, that is, they're kind of speckled with black and white. Some of them are dark in color. Okay, you see here the two different variations of color on dark bark, and then here you see the two different colorations. It's kind of hard to see that one, isn't it? On a bark that's covered in this thing called lichen. Lichen grows on rocks and on the bark of trees. It's kind of like kind of a type of fungus. It's in kind of in this fungus family, and it will color the bark where it's growing a lighter color. Well, way back in the 1800s, most of the trees were covered in this lichen, and most of the moths were this speckled coloration because, of course, the dark moths stand out more and they're more likely to be eaten. The ones that are speckled have camouflage and they're less likely to be eaten. So when the scientists look at the population of peppered moths, they see in the 1800s how most of them are this speckled when they do a survey of the moths. Then the Industrial Revolution happens, and during the Industrial Revolution, we began burning coal. Coal, of course, is a great source of energy, but it pollutes the environment. And it polluted the environment so much that the lichen died. So now we've got trees that look more like this one. The lichen die off the tree, and now we have dark bark. And you can see how easy it is now to see the speckled moth on the dark bark, and the dark moth is now camouflaged. And what scientists actually observed over the course of about 50 years was that the population of the peppered moths completely changed, and most of the population after that 50-year period were dark compared with the speckled. The speckled was now the one that was less common because they would be more easily to be eaten. And so this change in coloration of the peppered moths population, we could see over the course of less than a person's lifetime, we saw a huge change in the population of peppered moths. And that was due to human activity, but it was still nature selecting because it was, birds or something eating them. So that's an example of what we see in nature in terms of natural selection. And now hopefully you understand the principles of Darwin's theory.